You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you again on a Thursday. I told you that I was potentially going to do a podcast if things continue to be newsy with college football and college athletics in general. And things obviously have started transpiring this week. I was going to do this a little bit earlier in the day, but I decided to go golfing, and I make no apologies. Though I probably should have just done the podcast if my first hole was any indication of my day, where I got onto the green on the second shot on a par 4, feeling pretty good about myself, things were going great, and then decided to 4-putt it on my way to a double bogey. So that goes to show you how well I did today, and things happened. So should have probably just done the podcast to start the day. You know, we make mistakes. It happened. So we're gonna get into a little bit more of the administrative side of college football today. So if you're already bored, I'm sorry. I'll try to keep it light, and so it's not too into the weeds. Try to keep you updated on kind of what's happening around college football, what you can expect this year, how it may impact Utah, that kind of stuff. So like I said, I'm not going to go too into the weeds. I don't want to bore you too much. Obviously, you're probably already bored with me anyway, except you're listening. So somehow I've got you hooked on this for some reason. Not really sure why. But we're going to talk about a little brief update on the official visits, a look at the college football playoff changes that took place, and then the new structure potentially for the power leagues, I should say. So we'll get into that and all that, but let me first tell you about our partners. Every possibility begins with a spark, and possibility can grow into something even better than expected. With a clear view of what matters most, your possibilities are endless. From its first flicker at the University of Utah, U First Credit Union has grown to meet its potential and ignites your possibilities. They've grown into Canyon View Credit Union. Same roots, new path. Welcome to Canyon View Credit Union. Check out the full details at canyonviewcu.com. All right, since our last podcast on Monday, where we talked a lot about the official visits and everything, there's been a little bit of changes, and there's going to be, right? Like I'm not going to sit here and pretend like this podcast is going to be fully up to date at times with what's going on, and I'm not going to bore you with all the various people coming in, but, you know, from time to time I want to give you an update. So we'll do that. And so since we last chatted on Monday, Utah has added 4 more players for an official visit throughout the next month or so. So that count puts it up to about 42, 4 more than on Monday. That can vary. Some haven't been as highly publicized. Some have. I've been trying, I pay attention to this a ton. Trying to get involved, trying to see where all these kids are going, and we'll see. But by my count, we're up to 42 right now. So there's that. So recently added this week was 4-star offensive tackle Colin Campbell. He's the number 1 recruit in Arizona. Obviously with Utah, as we talked about on Monday, looking to potentially replace Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu, offensive tackle becomes a very hot commodity at the University of Utah. And as I mentioned, Utah has shown that they'll play true freshmen in that position if they're ready. And the fact that you have a 4-star guy, the number 1 rated player in Arizona, shows that, they're committed, right? They're not committed. They're interested. That's what I meant to say. And so the fact if you could get the number 1 kid out of Arizona is a pretty strong sign. It would be great if you could get that. He's visiting June 6th. So that's one that we'll get to know here soon. He does have an official visit with Michigan State on May 30th. Those are the only 2 that he has scheduled, at least publicly right now, or at least what I can see. And so we'll see what happens there. Obviously, he's got interest from Arizona schools. That's going to be in there. I would assume that there's some considerations there. But if you can pull the number one player from Arizona, especially in a position of potential need, that's a huge win for Utah if they can get that done. So obviously a big name to watch going into this season, and we'll see what happens. Also visiting on June 6th was newly announced three-star QB Michael Johnson. He's from Georgia. He's going to be visiting the same time as fellow QB Oscar Rios. He's a four-star guy. The guy that I said is probably the top of Utah's radar in terms of quarterbacks for this class. But they're doing their due diligence and trying to bring in some other quarterbacks to really kind of solidify that kind of situation. So you'll have two QBs visiting on that day, assuming that Rios does stay with his official visit that day. But really interesting to kind of compare these two and put them together. Rios obviously is the higher rated player and would bring the more attention, the QB that Utah would want the most. But you've got to get your options and you got to get some guys in there. So really fascinating to kind of see how this works. It could be a very QB/offensive heavy day with Colin Campbell there as well, and kind of looking to say, hey, here's your future kind of situation. So there's that. And then two other players were announced who will be visiting on June 10th. The first is four-star wide receiver Chase Campbell. He's from Texas. He's actually the number 2 rated player in Texas, which is pretty impressive for Utah, especially at the skills position. To get an official visit there, he's rated the 20th best receiver in the country. And he has, guys or schools all over the country seeking him out. He's got official visits scheduled with Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Kansas State, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, and Baylor. So Utah will be one of many there. Those Big 12 schools especially, he's doing kind of a rapid fire official visit season. So he's going to jump in there and have one almost every other day for that little bit. So it'll be a quick visit, but one that Utah has the potential to be able to highlight. Obviously, if Utah can show that they need wide receivers and that there would be an open room and open competition for that. But if you can at least get in his ear, show out at the campus, kind of show what you can be, and then if Utah can back it up this year on the field. I'm not saying that they get Chase Campbell, but those are the kind of names that you need to get to kind of start increasing your chances, right? You've got to be able to kind of showcase your ability there. And so, that'll be a tall task to be able to get Chase Campbell to commit to Utah, just the optics of it, everything, obviously the teams that he's visiting. Texas Tech alone could probably pay, a ton of money against all those teams and win just based on money alone. So, really interesting, if they can keep in his ear and if they can back it up on the field to kind of show, hey, we can highlight wide receivers, there's a chance, right? There's always a chance. But the fact that you can bring in a guy like that shows that Utah's making some inroads, obviously a lot of room to work with, but it can be an attractive place, especially since Utah really can use more wide receivers, especially top-end receivers. And then lastly is a 3-star defensive end in Prince Williams. He actually took an official visit to Utah back in March, so he's familiar with the campus. He's close by, has a good reputation with the coaches there and everything there. He's the number 3 rated player in Nevada, but he will also be visiting on June 10th. He already has Utah in his top 5. The other 4 are Arizona, BYU, Miami, and Wisconsin. So some good names there to be able to compete with, and a good potential for Utah to be able to add another defensive end that could be talented for the Utes. So a lot of highly ranked players here in terms of their respective state classes. A lot of guys that they're looking for, guys that are getting offers from a lot of other programs that are wanted. And so we'll see what happens, right? With 42 players coming in, obviously not all of them are going to sign with Utah. There's going to be some that are taking a visit simply as kind of a gesture of kindness of being able to recruit them. Utah may have been first, or it could have been, they want to keep good graces there, and you keep that door open for potential transfer portal market type stuff. But by and large, as I mentioned on Monday, this becomes a very pivotal part of the year for Utah's recruiting. Utah always kind of starts a little bit slow. They've been ramping it up a little bit more by getting it in the summer. But by and large, this is becoming the bulk of their recruiting period. and where you're going to start seeing a majority of their class signed, or at least committed before the early signing day in December. So this will be a pivotal point, and we'll see what happens. The official visits that we're going to start seeing come next week, and so we'll get into that. So let's jump into some of the more administrative stuff for college football. So it was announced today from the College Football Playoff Management Committee that they were making changes to the 12-team playoffs. Now, this isn't any of the changes that have been talked about recently, where potentially expanding to 14 or 16 teams. There's 1 year left on the contract for 2025, the 2025-26 playoff. It is 20. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's the 2025 season playoff. We'll just leave it at that. Those are already under contract. Moving forward beyond that, that's up in the air, and there's been a lot of discussion about how to move forward with that. There was some conversation if they changed this year to kind of, move it to a different model. But for the most part, that has kind of stayed the same. So the 12-team playoff is around for one more year. The expectation is that it'll grow beyond that, but right now you will have one more year of the 12-team playoffs. And as it was seen, there was some nuances to the 12-team playoff that really kind of confused people. It really didn't make a lot of sense. It wasn't a straight seeding in terms of the committee will rank the 12 teams that are in and seed them based on how they felt were the best. What had happened was the top 4 conference champions got the top 4 seeds. Now, that didn't always, sit well with a lot of people. For example, a team that was ranked 2 the entire season, at best, is now number 5. And then that gives them actually a better spot than even the number 1. You saw Oregon was the number 1 team in the country and ended up losing their second round game, which is their first game because they got the bye, but they ended up getting a harder draw based on how it went. So it wasn't an exactly perfect model. It was trying to give some competitive balance to all of the conferences to try to make sure that everyone has an equal shot, or every, conference that got a top 4 seed would get a, first round bye and kind of give them that benefit, but it didn't actually work the way that many expected. And there was a big push to just go to a straight seeding, try to make sure that it, was based on really kind of how teams were viewed based on the selection committee. So what had happened was today officially they decided to do away with the top 4 seeds come from the top 4 conferences, and instead the committee felt, quote, it was in the best interest of the game to make this adjustment to change it to straight seeding. So seeding based on the final rankings by the selection committee. Now, the caveats here are you still have the top 5 conference champions. They still get an automatic berth into the playoff, okay? So in the past, it was the top 4 or top 5 conference champions still, they got theirs, but the 5th one was just put in as kind of like an at-large. They were thrown in there as, wherever they landed. So the top 4 got the first round buys. The 5th one was kind of on the outside in, but you were in the playoffs, so everything is good. This time, the top 5 conference champions will still get in, but then they will be seated appropriately on where the selection committee puts them. So, for example, a situation, let's say, like Oregon, number 1, Ohio State, number 2, those two, if they both get in, which I would assume they would, will then be 1 and 2. If you have conference champions that are not ranked inside the top 12, top 15, whatever it may be, they still get in, but then they get seated lower. You may remember a few years ago when, I think it was the COVID year where, I could be mixing up these teams, and I apologize. This just came to the top of my head. But you had a Pac-12 team that was expected to get into the playoffs, and the other team won. I think it was Oregon and USC, and I'm blanking on who won to be able to get there and threw them in. Maybe I'm even confusing that. Here we are. But this prevents, teams from really having bad years, winning that conference championship, and then suddenly, not really bad years, but having less than stellar years compared to their peers, and then jumping in and getting a first round bye. So in theory, you could still be a top 5 conference. Somebody from the Big 12 could still be in the top 5 conferences, but if they are the lowest ranked team, they will be at number 12. So, that gives kind of a little bit more true parity to the game, where it sets itself up where you have a true 1v12. Well, I guess you wouldn't because you'd have the first round buys, but you get the point where you're going to get a little bit more true based on what the selection committee is putting. So the top 5 conference champions will get in, but then they will be seated appropriately based on how the rest of the field is there. So, it'll be an interesting spot, but at the same time, this also gives Notre Dame an opportunity to be higher. Let's say Notre Dame ended up being in the top 4. In the past, they couldn't get there. The best that they could be is number 5. And so this gives them potential to get the number 1 seed. It gives, a Boise State. Boise State could have jumped in there and they could be top. The reality is Group of 5 is slowly getting more and more out of the way here. Their only guarantee now is that 5th conference spot, right? And so if there's other teams that get in the top 12, that's there, but it's getting more and more where it's the Big Ten, it's the SEC, and then the rest of these teams may just have one spot. It could be the Big 12 or the ACC has one spot. A conference like the Mountain West or some other Group of 5, Group of 6 conference gets in that way, and so it becomes challenging. But at least it's based on kind of the record and everything that way, and so we'll see kind of how that shakes out if this helps. The reality is this is going to be a short time fix. The next steps essentially are it's going to be a 14 or 16 team playoff, most likely with a 16 team playoff. I think that's been kind of the consensus of where schools have wanted to go. That way there's not first round buys. Everybody just plays and you go into a true bracket style from the very beginning. Not that it wasn't a bracket style, but you do get 16 teams. Now this becomes a very tricky situation because moving forward with 2026 and on, the conferences that control this are the Big Ten and the SEC. As you may have listened to a podcast in weeks past where I kind of detailed this a lot more. What had happened was back when these conferences were kind of shifting and there was conference alignment and a lot of different things going on, the ACC and Big 12, whether they meant to or just kind of felt like they needed to in terms of survival, gave the 2 power conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC, full reign and control of the college football playoffs moving forward. And so essentially, these 2 conference commissioners and their administrators could decide whatever they want. Now, you have to play along, right? Like these 2 conferences could say, yeah, we're just going to do this and this is how it's going to be, tough luck. But at the same time, there's a lot that goes into this that, lawsuits will get involved, legislatures will get involved. Like it's not as easy as the Big Ten and the SEC just simply saying, we're going to do this and steamroll everybody. With that said, don't put it past them to do things that's going to be in their best interest. And already, as we've talked about before, that has been out there in terms of the proposed plan is essentially a 4-4-2-2-1. What that means is the Big Ten and the SEC would get 4 automatic bids into the playoffs. So 8 teams right there, 4 from each conference. And then the Big 12 and the ACC would each get 2 auto bids from their conference, giving that, a good representation of each conference. Then the Group of 6 has 1 guaranteed, and then the remaining are 3 at large. If Notre Dame is in that top 15, top 12 scenario, they are also guaranteed a spot in there. So that essentially leaves 2 at-large teams left. Now, on the surface, this has, opportunities to be a great system, right? We know that the Big Ten and the SEC are by and large going to have the most representatives in the playoffs, right? It's backed by a lot of the history of what's gone on in the rankings. These 2 conferences, especially now that they continue to consolidate more of the power programs and the top teams, are naturally going to have some of the best programs out there. And it's not very difficult to sit here and pick out 4 teams from each conference that'll go to the playoff. I believe back, a few weeks ago when I did this, I showed kind of the numbers of what it is. By and large, that's actually to some extent kind of being generous to these conferences who on average probably get more than 5 if you were to expand these rankings, the past college football playoff rankings into this. So they're, looking at this and saying, hey, we're being respectful. We're going to give you each, a fair number. we're going to take 4 because we clearly have the best teams in college football. Big 12 and ACC, you get 2. And on the surface, like, you have to look at that if you're the Big 12 and the ACC, and you jump at that, right? You say, okay, yep, we'll take it. Because right now you're only guaranteed 1. And so the fact that you can get a guaranteed 2, regardless of how they finish, and most likely that would be your 2 conference teams, right? You would have to, the 2 teams that end up in the conference championship. I would assume that that would be the general consensus of how a team goes, assuming that also conference championships continue. That's another discussion for another day. But at least you get 2 teams, whereas, last year or years past, there's only 1. You're only guaranteed 1. And, that gives you more money. That gives you more opportunities to be able to kind of put your product out on the market and that kind of stuff. Group of 6, you still get 1. And that's a tough situation. But anymore, we are starting to see more and more that the FBS is really splitting into 2 halves. If not, there's already talk that the Power 2 exists. And for a lot of points, it does exist. But you're getting even more disparity between the Power League conferences versus the Group of 6. And the Group of 6 in a lot of ways is being treated as kind of a training ground to be able to move these guys up into the higher leagues, right? Like, that's just the nature of it. Like, I'm not trying to say anything disrespectful. This is just the nature of it. The Power 5 or Power 4 now, they look at a lot of these Group of 6 teams as kind of a training ground to say, hey, go develop the best players, and once they're ready, we're going to take them and put them on our team, and then we're going to go dominate with them. It's no different than how Major League Baseball looks at it. You've got AA, you've got AAA, you've got majors. The Major League Baseball. You've got a farming system that essentially helps there, and as much as that is not the way that college football wants to approach that, that's exactly what it is. And so you've got this system that really is difficult for these conferences. And so what happens is it's easy for the Big 12 and the ACC to say, yeah, we got this, simply because the disparity between them and the top 2 conferences is already growing. But between those 4 and the remaining FBS teams, those Group of 6 teams in the conferences, that becomes a challenge, right? And so on the surface, this looks like an easy bet. Take it, run, go with it. You acquiesce power already to these 2 conferences, and at least they're giving you some opportunities. The problem there is, though, it's not an exact science, right? That's assuming that these 2 conferences are always going to have the power. And as we've learned in college football or basketball or any of this, power is cyclical, right? Some of the top teams have been up there forever, and they're going to stay there forever, or at least it feels that way. But then things change, right? A few years ago, we were talking about Clemson's dynasty and talking about how dominant they are. Now, they're probably back this year, and you're going to hear Clemson is one of the top teams this year, and they haven't really strayed too far away. But the reality is they haven't been a consistent playoff team for a long time. But you guarantee them a playoff spot, and suddenly things change, right? Now, look, I'm using them as a standard. They're also in the ACC, and so that changes some metrics. But what I'm trying to say is it doesn't always work that way. By and large, the Big Ten and the SEC are probably going to have 8 of the top 10 teams on any given year. But that's not to say that there couldn't be 2 teams from the Big 12 or the ACC or even more teams that crack into that top 10. And then what, right? Like, let's say you have 3 teams inside the top 10. And sure, you still got the at-large teams. And so I'm painting this picture that, although unrealistic to some extent, it can still happen. You've essentially handcuffed yourself if this doesn't work out. If you have a number of teams that suddenly are highly ranked, but because the other conferences have a situation where they get auto bids, you may be left out. And you may be in a situation where you're frustrated because you have a top 5 team. This isn't going to happen, but you may have a top 5 team that gets left out of the playoffs because they're not in the Big Ten or the SEC or any of these other situations. I would be very, very skeptical that anything like that could happen. But you can see that there's different points that you can make, and I'm not articulating some of those as well as others in that room are going to. But this is not a model that everybody loves, right? The Big Ten and the SEC generally, I would say, love it because it gives them 4 automatic bids. And it in their view, shows the other conferences, hey, we're working. We're working to help you. It's like throwing the breadcrumbs to the little guy. Hey, we're going to give you some a spot at the table. And in the past, you've only had one spot, but now we're giving you two. Imagine that. You've been upgraded from the little kids table, and now there's two of you that get to be there. Isn't that so cool? Now you get to sit with the big kids, right? Now you get to be able to sit with the grown-ups, and you get to be a part of this great feast where we get a lot of money and everything goes well. But the 8 of us, the 8 teams that are already gotten in there, we control this. This is our show. Like I said, this isn't necessarily something that is too far-fetched, but this gives all the power to those 2 conferences, which they already have anyway, so it's kind of a moot point. But this isn't an easy situation, right? There's been a lot. This is the time of the year where there's a lot of the spring meetings. You get a lot of these conferences that meet on their own. You've got the ACC meetings a couple weeks ago. They met all together as athletic directors, coaches, different things that way. The Big 12 is actually meeting next week to be able to have theirs. I assume there's going to be stuff there. I was going to fly out to go to these meetings, but I decided not to. We'll actually get some opportunities over Zoom to be able to talk to the coaches or athletic directors and different things that way. So we'll see. We'll see what comes out from the Big 12. Brett Yormark has been pretty vocal about kind of his stance on some of these things. The ACC has been pretty vocal on that. Whether it's anonymous people talking to reporters or people being pretty open about it, they're not for it. They're not for giving up all this power to the Big Ten and the SEC. Now, on the other side of this, though, the Big Ten and the SEC can continue to put this out there, let the little kids fight in their view, and at the end of the day can come back to the table and say, look, guys, we tried. We tried to give you something that was competitive. We tried to give you something that would be fair to all, and since you guys couldn't deal with it, we're going to do it our way and really just kind of put it out whatever they want, right? They could say, okay, now we're going to have 5, and you guys get 1. They could do whatever they want, right? And these guys, like, it's really easy to talk about them as unembodied commissioners, but at the same time, they have to work with their peers, right? Like, the Big Ten and the SEC could steamroll, and they could do that. There's nothing potentially stopping them from doing that, but they also still have to work with these people. And it becomes very toxic if that's the situation. And so there's I can't imagine a world where they kind of wash their hands and say, we tried, and then steamroll, but it's not out of the realm of possibility either, right? Conferences are going to do what's in the best interest of their conference. And until there's one overarching principal or commissioner or whatever you want to call it over the league or over all of college football, each conference is going to continue to do whatever they want. And so we'll see what happens. Now, the one caveat here is Ross Dellinger of Yahoo Sports. If you don't follow Ross, I recommend it. He's great at all this. This is kind of where his bread and butter of reporting. He's phenomenal at getting into these meetings, getting into the weeds, and trying to digest it in a way that it makes it easy for us as plebeians. But he reported previously that Notre Dame is also against this format. Their athletic director has claimed that he's not for this format either. Notre Dame, they're obviously not tied to a conference, but they also have kind of their own special powers that allow them to be able to get in. And most years, as long as they're in the top 12, they're generally guaranteed a spot. So it hasn't been a bad spot for them. But at the same time, I think they look at the power structure of this and they don't like how this is moving. Many want to be able to see this as a straight seeding as well. The top 16 teams get put in. I don't know that that's necessarily a bad opportunity. I think if you're not in the top 16, you don't probably deserve to be in there anyway. And the disparity between 1 through 16 is pretty large. I can hear people already saying in basketball you have a 16 seed. Granted, these are far more down the list, but you have a 16 seed beating a number 1 seed all the time. Basketball is completely different, I think, based on this. And, I don't see that happening as often. And even in basketball, a 16 seed, has only done it twice now? Maybe once, I can't remember. It just happened recently for the first time, and then now it's happened again. So You're not going to get a ton of these teams that are 16 seeds stunning a number one team. Not to say it can't happen. Obviously, teams like Utah, Boise State, TCU, they did these things years ago to be able to kind of show the power structure that it wasn't always that easy. But the reality is these are few and far between, and most likely, anyone even beyond number 16 is probably not going to get in there anyway, assuming that the selection committee is ranking these appropriately, right? And you can have your arguments about the selection committee, but at the end of the day, this committee is put together by the people in charge that decided to say, hey, you guys go figure this out. And if they got that wrong, that's on them, right? That's how it works. But the thing is, like, the top 16 teams are the top 16 teams for the most part. Like, as I'm doing my rankings for the AP poll, there's a lot of flaws to that system, right? I don't love it completely at times. Ranking is not always a apples to oranges comparison. It's not always an apples to apples comparison. It's a very difficult situation that it's tough to be able to rank teams that have different strengths of schedules, different things that way. Now, I would hope that the selection committee has far more resources than I do to be able to rank these teams. But the reality is it's still not equal. A team like Boise State does not have the same rankings or the same strength of schedule as a team like Georgia, right? They just don't. Now, some years that may be closer, but other years it's not. They're going to play a much more difficult schedule each year. Look at the Big 12 teams that were added 2 years ago. The BYUs, the Cincinnatis, the Houstons. I'm blanking on the fourth. UCF. They found out quickly, and Utah found this out, early on when they joined the Pac-12, that a Power 4 conference schedule is much more difficult. It's much more challenging to be able to have the depth and the year-over-year competition that it takes to win at a high level. So, it's hard to rank these things, but, we're going to see. So there's not a consensus yet on what the 2026 seeding will go. It may follow that 4-4-2-2-1 model. It may go to a straight seeding. We'll see. They do have to get it figured out sooner rather than later, but they still have some time. They've got to get that done. They've got some contracts that they need to sign with the networks, different things that way. But for the most part, it's looking like it will expand to probably 16 teams, maybe 14, but 16 seems the most likely. The question remains how they will be seeded, how they will be picked, will there be at-large teams, that kind of stuff. So not much to worry about there, but you have to look at where the Big 12 and the ACC specifically stand if you're Utah or any teams in that situation to kind of see your access to it. Right now, these teams are very happy to be able to be in the system that they are because there's a guaranteed spot. Every team in the Big 12 right now knows that if they win the conference, which is no small feat, if you win the conference, you're guaranteed a spot. Unlike Utah a few years ago when they were in the Pac-12 and they were, the 2019 season, they were on the doorstep of a playoff. Now, look, they didn't deserve the playoffs because they lost. Like, I'm not trying to sit here and advocate for Utah there. This is, they did it themselves. But maybe things changed based on how they viewed it. Obviously, if there was an expanded playoffs, Utah would be in because you'd have two teams from the Pac-12 that were ranked pretty highly. But you look at that and you can say, hey, we don't have to, I don't want to say you don't have to try as hard, but the payout at the very end is that you get a playoff spot, right? And if you're still competitive and you still are in that spot, maybe there's a chance to get an at-large bid. Those things still exist. Whereas in the years past, a 4-team playoff obviously only rewarded the top 4 teams. It was a much more difficult challenge. So really fascinated to kind of see how this develops. It's never a dull summer, whether it be conference realignment or the fully changing of college football. There's always something. And as I said, Ross Dellinger is generally one of the best ones to follow. There's plenty of other reporters out there that you could follow, but he seems to be right on top of it, has a lot of insight, gets a lot of scoops in terms of getting insider information that others don't. And so, he's a great follow if you want. I'm not here to carry Yahoo Sports' water, but he's definitely one of the best out there. So now as part of that, we'll transition to the last part of this, and this is where it gets bogged down even more. The 12-team playoffs, 16-team playoffs, whatever it may be, that's pieces of cake compared to this next level of intrigue into college football. So, I'm not going to get into all the nuances of this. There's a lot of background here, and I've tried to give a lot of this over the last few podcasts to kind of give that if you really need a refresher on that, go back and listen to the podcast where we talked about the house settlement and the different structures of college football. But, the short version is the NCAA is still trying to settle this house settlement. This is the pay for play, not pay for play, but to pay athletes from the athletic department. Most athletic departments out there, especially from the Power Four, are preparing as if there is, this settlement that is going to be settled. And so every athletic department out there is essentially moving forward as if this is going to happen. They have till July 1st to get it done. After that, I honestly don't know what happens, but essentially, as long as it's signed by July 1st, everything moves forward. Athletic departments can pay up to $20.5 million to their athletes, spread out however they decide, all that kind of stuff. There is some holdups with that. The judge, Claudia Wilkins, has decided to, she wants to kind of look at this for future athletes that aren't allowed to basically sign right now. And so there's some kind of give and take there that's going on how that gets sorted out, whether it be roster limits or different things that way to help. Because right now how it would go is, there's 105 roster spots. Teams a lot of the times will go to 120, 110, whatever it may be. And so they've had to cut some of these walk-on players to basically account for the 105 and get them on. Everybody is essentially on scholarship one way or the other. You don't have to have full scholarships. You can have smaller numbers, but the roster limit is 105. Essentially, there's a lot going on with this house settlement that it's its own mess. It's still in her hands, and we're kind of in a wait-and-see period. The reality is it's most likely to settle. If it doesn't, then it does have to go to court, and then it becomes a completely different situation. But I think most universities are preparing for a settlement, assuming that Claudia Wilkins, agrees on what these two parties have come together with. I use that as the background because this house settlement has to settle before everything else can kind of fall into place. Everybody is preparing for those next steps beyond the settlement, and so it's interesting. It's funny because as I'm right here, I'm sorry, Twitter came up, and I just want to read this. Big 12 Commissioner Brett Yormark to CBS Sports on today's college football vote. He says, quote, "Today's decision might not be the best thing for the Big 12, but it was the best thing for college football. I hope what's best for college football continues to be a priority in any discussions moving forward." Nothing groundbreaking by any means, but he's clearly advocating for the Big 12. Going back to that point, the Big 12, with Arizona State and then the Mountain West with Boise State, they were two of the teams that got the top 4 spots based on that pass structure. So, the Big 12 is going to look at that and say, there's a potential. Arizona State I can't remember where they were at. They could have been ranked 12th or 10th or whatever it may be, right? That changes how things go. So really, really interesting there. That's a quick side note based on that. So anyways, so the house settlement, that has to all be there. Everybody's assuming it will be. So that's kind of the background of where it needs to be. What happened last week was Tennessee covertly signed a law into place that essentially waived them from any legal challenges against basically what the NCAA was going to do. They can kind of create their own laws regardless of what happens. So, for example, they say an athletic association can't violate state law or prohibit an association from interfering from a school's membership status. So they're essentially saying they can do what they want. The NCAA has no power over them. And so what happened, and this has been months in the making, but essentially the Power Four leaders created a document that essentially would bind all of these schools together, saying there can't be new laws created that would challenge what the future of the league would do. And they can't sue them. You would essentially move to arbitration. Arbitration is kind of a mediation point where you come together, you settle it out of court, essentially. You're not going to put them in a courtroom and try to sue them. It really is kind of two parties coming together with a mediator trying to come to an agreement based on something. But essentially, it removes all the legal powers away from that. As part of this, All of these schools are expected to sign this agreement, and if they don't, they can potentially be kicked out of the conference. Now, there's a lot of steps here. The whole purpose of this, at least on the surface, and based on the reporting that has been out there, is this was meant to be able to bind all of these schools, specifically the Power 4 schools, so that they can abide by the same rules. It's basically looking at what the future of this NIL clearinghouse is going to be, where they're going to review the NIL deals and say, hey, this is good, this is bad, this wouldn't be approved normally, that kind of stuff. It would prevent collectives generally from being able to give deals. I'll get into that one in a second, but it would force, whatever they say, that clearinghouse, which is run by Deloitte, they would get the full say. And they would be able to have the benefit of not being sued by any of these member schools. And so essentially, you're giving them kind of the weight that they need to be able to make those decisions. So if a player comes in and any deal over $500 through NIL would have to go to this clearinghouse, and the clearinghouse would have to say, yes, we approve of it, or no, we don't. And assuming this runs appropriately, and Deloitte is much better than what the NCAA would be, so there is potential that this could be okay. There is potential that some deals get nixed. You don't just get the true pay for play. You don't have guys that are just coming to X school because boosters want to pay $10 million. Nobody's paying $10 million, but let's say they're paying $500,000 to an athlete with no real NIL value to it, right? True NIL is supposed to be you're getting paid for your name, image, and likeness. So generally that's through commercials, that's through promoting something using your name, that kind of stuff, right? Or your jersey sales, whatever that may be. There's other aspects to it. But there's a lot in college football right now, since the NCAA can't really enforce anything, where it is a pay-for-play system. You can go to a booster and say, hey, we need $500,000 to lock up this kid, and there's nothing with teeth right now that says you can't do that. So what this deal would do, this college sports commission that they're creating, would essentially allow this clearinghouse to be able to have the teeth it needs to be able to stop that. And all of these member schools, all of the Power 4 schools, would have to abide by it, or if they don't agree to this, they can go to arbitration, or if they don't even sign the document, they can be kicked out of the conference. Now, let's be real. Imagine Ohio State saying, no, we're not going to do this. The Big Ten says, okay, we're going to kick you out. One, the Big Ten isn't going to kick out Ohio State. Two, the networks aren't going to allow it. Three, all of everything isn't going to allow that kind of stuff. So I'm really fascinated to see kind of what would happen there. But what they're trying to do is come to an agreement where they're all going to be on the same page. And maybe that's getting closer and closer to a commissioner over all of college football. I don't know. Regardless, this isn't a document that has been signed yet. It can't be signed until after the House settlement. It's not finalized. They're still going to be debating it. There's a lot that goes into this, but this is kind of the future of what they're looking at. They're trying to find something that would bind all these schools together, and so the loopholes kind of get closed, all that kind of stuff. The reality is there would be so many more lawsuits as part of this. A state like Tennessee, who has these laws, would fight like crazy to be able to say you can't, say that state laws aren't allowed. There's a lot of nuance here, and I don't want to get into all of that, but essentially speaking, the league, and I'm talking about those Power 4 conferences, are trying to find a structure that works. And just as kind of a side note, Deloitte did kind of do a quick look at kind of what the past NIL deals were. They announced this in their the ACC meetings. This is not coming from me. This is coming from other reporters like Ross Dellinger and others who reported this. But Deloitte said 70% of deals from collectives would be denied based on their clearinghouse rules. What they've done is they've used an algorithm to establish a, quote, compensation range for various deals. So they have their deal that essentially says, based on XYZ, a player should get, this amount of money within this range type stuff, right? Obviously, there's going to be different things that set that up, teams that have kind of shifted the market for that. But the reality is you kind of have to have a range, or else it just becomes pure chaos, which is what it has been. And so Deloitte is trying to run this in a way that would be a little bit more standardized. You're giving ranges. You can have a top end, you can have a bottom end, middle of the court, whatever it may be. But as long as it fits within that compensation range and it is approved through all the metrics that they have to justify an NIL deal, then it would be okay. So like I said, 70% of deals from collectives would be denied. That's essentially all of you pulling your money together, the collective using that money how they see fit. A lot of those would be just passing over cash to these athletes and no real NIL value as part of this. Or there was faux rules put in place to make it look like it was an NIL deal. We all know how that goes. 70%, that's a lot. Now, on the other side, 90% of deals from public companies would be improved. This is the true NIL. This is Ken Garff coming out there and saying, Cam Rising, we want to sponsor you, put you on our commercials. This is saying go out to America First Credit Union and be one of the spokespersons for them using your image, that kind of stuff, right? There's other deals. Those are more public, but those are what the true NIL deals are. So 90% of those deals would likely be approved. They said 80% of the deals were less than $10,000. 99% of the deals were less than $100,000. Those were from the public companies. That's what those NIL dollars will look like, or at least that's what they're kind of looking like. So really curious to see how this moves forward. If the settlement passes, which everybody assumes that it will, this is the next direction of what it will be. The Deloitte will run this NIL clearinghouse. They've called it NIL Go. Like I said, they've got their algorithm. They've got their different things. They will be reviewing that. But to add the legal teeth, so to speak, to this is what they're doing to create that College Sports Commission. They're trying to find a way to bind all these conference schools together. It can be teams from the lower divisions as well, but this is what they're trying to do, is to make it so that it's trying to be a little bit more fair. They're trying their best, at least on the surface, to make this fair. Now, are there teams and are there conferences that are going to skirt the rules? 100%, right? There's going to be a lot more under the table type stuff that has been in the past, but at the same time, they're trying to do things to get it more out in the open, trying to keep things consistent. Will it work? Who knows? None of this has worked, right? It's been chaos, and I understand the frustration that fans have. I understand the frustration that coaches have, that athletic directors have. Like, this is not an easy one-fit-all model for everybody. A lot of people say this will get solved with employees, meaning the athletes are employees. At least there's contracts, there's different things that gets put into it, but there's, universities generally speaking don't want to employ all these athletes because it just becomes so much more of a headache. But I think we're getting to a model where some of that becomes much more realistic. This becomes a challenge in college football to still live in this world where it's amateurism masking itself, or professionalism masking itself as amateurism. Obviously, a lot more of that amateurism talk has gone away. A lot of these players are being paid handsomely for their ability to play at this level. Truthfully, I feel like the NFL should come in and step in and try to create a framework that helps. This should be kind of the feeding ground to the NFL and use something that helps them, right? This is where these players want to go anyway. Very few, if any, are probably saying, no, I want to go to the CFL or I want to go to the UFL. The NFL is their dream. This is the model. And if the NFL really wanted to help this, they could find a way to step in and say, hey, here's the structure that we want to do. Now, that gets messy. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like just because the NFL has its way that, everything will be better. But the NFL has tremendous amount of weight. They are the greatest and most powerful league in the entire world, I would argue. You could argue some of those European leagues with soccer and everything, sure. But college football, at least in the United States, is the most popular and most powerful league out there. And if they want to throw their weight behind it and they want to try to find it, there's going to be a possibility to make it work. I don't know that the NFL really wants to weigh in on that, especially because this involves, so many more areas than just private companies owning a team. But there could be something there where they can have their kind of put their weight behind it. With that said, there needs to come to a point where there is a structure where all of these teams can kind of work. If not, you're going to get a Tennessee state law. You're going to get a Georgia state law. You're going to get an Alabama state law, a California state law. California's will be crazy. I'd be interested to see what that was. But you're going to get all these disparate laws that really make it a challenge for the NCAA, which is just a governing body for all the university presidents, which clearly has no teeth at this point. It's there to be able to help, but when it doesn't help, then it's just lawlessness, right? Now it's just every team, every conference, everybody going at it for themselves. The fact that you have athletic directors or coaches out there speaking pretty openly about how the NCAA has no teeth kind of shows that they feel emboldened to do what they want. And there's so many lawsuits out there. There's so many different things that make this a difficult situation for college football that it's hard for college football fans to still feel that engagement. It's hard for them to still feel that loyalty to the program and to the fan or to the players that they loved. The transfer portal, you can argue, has ruined that, right? I still think that the transfer portal is far more beneficial than anything else, and that's not the problem. The problem is people are more worried about the money, and so that's adding that extra layer to the transfer portal that really makes people upset. But I don't blame fans right now for feeling frustrated, right? Forever it was, oh, these players represent my school. I went to this school. My family went to this school. Or even if you didn't, you had some allegiance to that school. And now suddenly it's being ripped apart because this player that praised that he was so committed to this school decides to go elsewhere. I still think some of that's overblown in the sense that fans are getting frustrated with that. Nobody would blink an eye if you decided to leave your job for another place, even if you pledged your allegiance to that company, right? Things change. You want better opportunities for you and your family? So do these athletes. Now, some of it is a little bit more greedy, but so is corporate world, right? Sometimes you'll chase the dollar because the dollar's there. But there's an issue here where fans are starting to turn away in terms of their interest because of how chaotic this is. At the end of the day, once football kicks off in August and September, everybody will forget this, right? Everybody will forget about the transfer portal. They'll forget about NIL. They'll forget about those things outside of a few instances where NIL, we saw this at Utah. People got frustrated with how much money Cam was making to not play. Unfortunately, there was some negative sides of that. But the reality is all that is forgotten once the football is kicked off. And we go back to loving college football and everybody's excited. You rally around the players that are on your team and you're excited. But all of the distractions, the problems part of this is the non-football playing days are so much greater than the playing football days. And so there's a lot of noise out there that allows you to kind of doubt your fandom in college football. And I'm not saying you're wrong. But at the same time, there isn't anything, I don't want to say there isn't anything, but the game is still being played. It's still popular. There's so many people that get into it, but I understand if you as a fan are disenfranchised with how it is all done. The reality is you're not alone. Conference commissioners are in the same spot. ADs are in the same spot. Coaches are in the same spot. And it's just a challenge. Everybody is trying to figure it out. It's literally trying to fix the boat while you're on the water as it's taking on water. This isn't a great situation right now. And the problem is the NCAA could have fixed this years ago, but instead decided to mask itself as amateurism and hide behind the bushes and pretend like none of this was happening. And then once it all came forward and lawsuits started to peek out and the real weight of this started to kind of showcase itself, they were left sunk. And now this is where we're at. So you can blame the NCAA, you can blame all the member schools, you can blame a whole bunch of people, and you'd probably be right. But this is where we're at now. And as much as everybody's trying to fix this boat with Band-Aid and duct tape and whatever it may be, there's no strong leader, there's no strong solution. You now have two conference commissioners, two conferences that are saying, hey, we're the top dog and we're gonna do this, but at the same time they have their vested interest. And they're not always looking for the people that are in the bottom of the ship that are taking on water that are suffering the most. A team like Utah State here in this state is suffering way more than BYU and Utah. They have become so much more of a feeder ground or a farming system for the Power Four than any other program in the state. And Utah fans and BYU fans can be frustrated that their players are going to an Alabama or Georgia or whatever it may be, but it's so much more smaller than the guys that are below them. But that's the nature that we're in, right? And until somebody comes in and tries to fix this all wholly, it's not going to work. And that's not to say that disparity is, never going to go away or it's going to get closer to going away. There's a reality. The group of six is just at a lower level, generally speaking, than the Power Four. That's just the nature of it. That's fine, right? And if we could recognize that more, it would be so much better for college football instead of trying to pretend that everybody is equal. Now, with that being said, that's some of the things that makes college football, college basketball the greatest. You have a MAC team that can come in there and muck things up and just really have some fun and make the lives of somebody else difficult. We love when the FCS team comes in there in week 1 and beats a Power 4 team. There's still some of that, right? But at the same time, the power structures, the actual structure of college football is different. And it should be treated as such. So really fascinated to see how this goes. This is so far from being over. There's a lot of nuance to this. As I said, I hope that I could explain it to you in a way that was beneficial. I hope I didn't get you too far in the weeds. I understand that this is very difficult. It's difficult for me, and I follow this on a day-to-day basis. I'm watching this stuff on a day-to-day basis. And quite honestly, when Ross tweeted that first thing about the membership agreement between, the power teams for this College Sports Commission, it took me a minute. And I had people reach out to me saying, hey, what does this mean? It takes a minute, right? And there's a lot of nuance to all of this stuff. And it's all changing, and everything is kind of all up in the air. States are doing their own things. Colleges are doing their own things. It's a mess. And so I don't blame you for not understanding it if you don't. But we're going to try to get through this together. Let's not let this be like the thing that frustrates us, right? Like, let's go back to this. Next week, we're going to be talking about the UCLA and Cal Poly game, right? Let's get into talking football. Let's not worry about the transfer portal. Let's not worry about NAL. And don't get me wrong, these are all things that you have to worry about. But let's talk football. So with that said, we're going to sign off today. We're going to come back next week. We're going to talk football. We're going to get into the weeds of real gaming. We're going to see how UCLA is better than last year, or are they? We're going to see if Utah's better than last year. I would assume they are. We talked about that. But we're going to get into the actual football. So thanks for tuning in. We'll try to update these periodically, try to see how the evolution of college football is changing, how your team may be impacted, and all that. But thanks for listening. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the Memorial Day weekend, and we'll get back to you next week.